I heard the crack before I understood what it was. It didn't sound like a branch snapping in the wind. It was dry, repeated, uneven, like wood giving in under pressure. I was hiking along an isolated trail in southern Arizona where almost no one passes when the sound came again, short, strained. Something was trying to move and couldn't. I stepped off the main trail and pushed through the dry vegetation. The air was already too hot for that time of morning, the kind of heat that rises from the ground and fills your lungs like warm dust. That's when I saw the tree, an old trunk, hollow at the center, leaning as if it had been dying for years. And there, stuck in that narrow opening, was the head of a jaguar. Her entire body was outside, her paws dug into the dirt, her belly too rounded to ignore. She was pregnant. She tried to pull her head back when she saw me. The trunk groaned, the wood pressed against her neck at the wrong angle. Every attempt to free herself only injured her more. She growled, a deep sound that vibrated straight through my chest. Even trapped, she was still a wild predator, and I was only a few yards away. Before I continue, let me ask you something. If this story has already pulled you in, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments what city and country you're listening from. I read every single one. Now come back with me to that moment, because I still hadn't realized how dangerous the situation truly was. When I stepped closer, I noticed something that made my stomach turn. Inside the trunk, there was wire embedded in the wood. It wasn't just a natural hollow. Someone had modified it, maybe to capture her, maybe to injure her. The metal was partially hidden beneath the bark. This wasn't an accident, and if someone had set that trap, there was a very real chance they would come back. I stood still for a few seconds, trying to decide whether I was being reckless. Yes, she was trapped, but she was still an adult jaguar, strong enough to kill me in seconds if she managed to twist her body the right way. The trunk held her head in place, but the rest of her body was free. Her front paws dug into the dirt, the muscles along her back tight, her tail whipping through the dry air. If I mistimed this, there wouldn't be a second chance. I took a slow step to the side, making sure she didn't lose sight of my movement. She growled louder, teeth exposed even with part of her muzzle pressed against the wood. Her belly tightened slightly. It wasn't my imagination. She was close to giving birth. The heat was suffocating, over 100 degrees, and the shade from the tree was no longer enough to protect her body. If she remained trapped for hours, the cubs wouldn't survive. That's when I heard the first sound coming from the brush. It wasn't wind. It was distant but too clear to ignore. A low howl, then another. Coyotes. They were far off, but sound carried easily across that open terrain. I felt the back of my neck prickle. Animals sense weakness. They sense vulnerability. And that jaguar, no matter how powerful she was trapped and pregnant. That made her a target. She heard them too. Her entire body stiffened. The growl shifted in tone. It was no longer directed at me. It was aimed at whatever was beyond the trees. The air suddenly felt heavier. The silence between the howls was worse than the sound itself. I instinctively scanned the area, calculating distances. If the coyotes approached in a group, they might try to force a situation, and I would be standing right in the middle of it. I stepped closer, ignoring the fear rising in my stomach. I needed to examine the wire. I knelt to the side, keeping my body out of direct reach of her paws. That's when I realized the metal wasn't only wrapped around the wood, it was tangled in the fur around her neck. Every time she pulled, the wire cut deeper. This wasn't just a trap. It was cruel enough to ensure she wouldn't leave that place alive, and the sounds in the brush were getting closer. I knew I couldn't wait. The sound of the coyotes came in waves, sometimes farther away, sometimes closer, as if they were circling the area before deciding whether to advance. The jaguar tried to pull her head again, and each movement drove the wire deeper into the thick fur around her neck. I could see faint reddish marks forming beneath her spotted coat. The inside of the trunk wasn't smooth, it was rough, splintered, with jagged wood scraping her skin every time she struggled. If she kept forcing herself like that, she could break her own neck before any other danger even arrived. I took a deep breath and shifted to the left, searching for a safer angle. She followed my movement with her eyes, the steady growl vibrating through the wood. It wasn't an empty threat. It was a warning. instinct telling her that I could also be danger. And maybe I was. I knelt slowly, feeling the heat of the ground rise through my knees. The smell there was a mix of cracked tree resin and oxidized metal from the hidden wire. This had been built with intention. Someone wanted to capture or kill, and I was interfering with something another person might consider property. I pulled out the small pair of pliers I always carry in my backpack from my days as a wildland firefighter. My hands were sweating, not just from the heat, but from the weight of the decision. I needed to cut the wire first before trying to widen the wood. If I split the trunk without removing the metal, it could clamp down even tighter around her neck. I moved my hand closer, inch by inch. The moment the pliers touched the wire, she reacted. Her front paw lashed out, passing inches from my arm, fast enough to tear skin if it had connected. The strike kicked up dust. My heart slammed so hard it almost made me pull back. That's when I heard another sound, different from the coyotes, heavier, branches snapping deeper in the brush. I couldn't immediately tell whether it was a deer, a wild boar, or something larger. The jaguar heard it too. Her body went completely rigid, muscles drawn tight like cables under tension. The growl stopped for a second, replaced by an alert silence. I felt something shift in the air. This was no longer just a situation between her and me. There was more life around us, more eyes hidden in the shadows of the trees, and all of them sensed vulnerability. I had to act before the forest decided to act on its own. I set the pliers against the wire again, and with one quick, precise movement, made the first cut. The snap of metal giving way sounded louder than I liked. She thrashed, the trunk groaning under the force. I instinctively jumped back, my heart in my throat. But something different happened. She didn't try to strike at me again. Instead, she took a deep breath, as if she felt the pressure ease slightly. I saw her belly contract once more, harder this time. It wasn't just stress. Labor was approaching. The sounds in the brush intensified, a closer howl, then silence, the kind of silence that comes before coordinated movement. I realized I didn't just have to free her from the trunk. I had to free her before nightfall, before smaller predators grew bold, before whoever set that trap decided to return and check it. And as I cut the second length of wire, I noticed something even more unsettling. The wood of the trunk was beginning to crack under the force of her pulling. If it split the wrong way, it could crush her skull. Time was no longer just against the two of us. Time was running. The second piece of wire fell to the ground with a dry snap, almost too small for the tension it carried. But the bigger problem now wasn't the metal, it was the wood. The trunk was splitting unevenly, vertical cracks running downward like scars. If I forced it open at the wrong point, I could cause the tree to clamp down even tighter around her skull. I stood and slowly circled the trunk, trying to assess where the pressure was weakest. The jaguar followed my every movement with her eyes, her body trembling not only from strain, but from exhaustion. That's when the wind shifted. A dry, scorching gust swept across the open ground behind us. With it came new sounds. It wasn't just coyotes anymore. I heard wings beating, vultures beginning to circle overhead. They always arrive before death, as if they can sense it in the air. And something inside me shifted when I realized that. The forest was already treating this scene like an ending, and I was still trying to turn it into a beginning. The jaguar made a stronger attempt to pull free. The trunk answered with a loud crack. I froze. A thick splinter broke away from the upper section, creating more space, but also forming a dangerous angle of lateral pressure. If she twisted sideways with force, she could dislocate her neck. I needed to stabilize the wood before doing anything else. From my backpack, I pulled a small metal wedge I used to secure doors during rescue operations. Carefully, I drove it into the widest crack in the trunk, trying to prevent it from snapping shut. The howls were closer now. I couldn't see the coyotes, but I could feel them out there, watching, waiting for the right moment. And then I heard another sound, different from all the others. A distant engine. Very distant, but unmistakable. It wasn't coming from the main road. It was coming from a secondary path, rarely used by local ranchers. My stomach went cold. If someone had set that trap, and if that someone was coming back, I moved to the front of the trunk again. The Jaguar was breathing harder now. Her belly tightened once more, stronger this time. A small sound escaped her compressed throat. Not a growl. Pain. I had to finish this now. I placed my hands against the sides of the wood, testing its resistance. If I could create just enough space for her head to tilt slightly, she might be able to pull free without breaking her neck. But the moment I began applying pressure, I heard branches being stepped on behind me. They weren't light steps. They were firm, human, and far too close. The footsteps stopped for a second, as if whoever was there was also assessing the situation. I didn't turn around immediately. If it was the person who set the trap, I didn't want to look threatening or too vulnerable. I kept my hands on the wood, but my entire body tightened. The Jaguar sensed it too. The growl returned, lower, deeper. It wasn't for me. It was for whatever stood behind me. "Hey!" The voice came out dry, suspicious. I turned slowly. Two men stood about 20 yards away. One wore a wide-brimmed hat. The other had something that looked like a rifle resting on his shoulder. They weren't in uniform. They weren't wildlife officers. Their expressions weren't surprise. They were irritation. "What are you doing there?" the taller one asked. My mind calculated too fast to feel natural. If I said I was saving the Jaguar, they could claim she was theirs. If I said I was just passing through, they might not believe me, so I gave them part of the truth. "She's going to die like that." The man with the rifle spat on the ground. "That's the point." The silence that followed was worse than any growl. The heat seemed to rise 10 degrees in a second. The Jaguar thrashed violently at the sound of their voices. The trunk cracked again. I knew that if she kept forcing herself like that, she could kill herself before they even decided to act. "Step away," the man said, taking a step forward. Something shifted inside me at that moment. It wasn't heroism. It was something simpler. I had already started this. I had already cut the wire. If I stepped back now, everything would have been for nothing. And worse, she would die knowing she had almost made it. "She's pregnant," I said, keeping my voice steady. "If you leave her trapped, you'll lose 2, maybe 3. The man hesitated, just for a second, too small to call compassion, big enough for me to realize this wasn't just about killing, it was about profit. They wanted to sell. Cubs are worth more alive. Behind me, the Jaguar made a different sound. A lower, strained cry. Her whole body trembled. Her belly tightened again, and this time I saw it clearly. Labor. The men exchanged a look. The wind picked up, lifting dust between us. Vultures circled lower in the sky. And then, unexpectedly, the man with the rifle lowered his weapon. 5 minutes, he said. "If she gets out, that's your luck. If she doesn't, we finish it." It wasn't mercy. It was calculation. I didn't have time to think anymore. I turned back to the trunk and pressed my shoulder against the wood, using my full body weight to force it open while keeping the wedge steady. The Jaguar was too weak now to react violently. She was just breathing fast, each contraction more visible than the last. The trunk groaned. A wider crack opened. "Now," I muttered, more to myself than to her. She pulled. For a second that felt endless. Nothing happened. Then her head slid free all at once, the wood scraping against her spotted fur. She fell sideways onto the ground, free, gasping, alive, but she didn't run. She tried to stand and couldn't. A powerful contraction bent her body inward. The men behind me fell silent. The forest did too. And there, beneath that split tree, in the heat of Arizona and the tension still vibrating in the air, the Jaguar began to give birth. The first cub was born in silence. Too small, too fragile, too wet for that scorching ground. I didn't move. I didn't dare. The Jaguar was exhausted, but her eyes were open now, alert, alive. She gently pulled the cub closer to her chest, licking it with slow but determined movements. The second came minutes later, beneath the same dry sky, still heavy with dust. 2 small bodies, trembling, struggling to take their first breaths. Behind me, I could feel the men watching. The one with the rifle wasn't speaking anymore. None of them were. The scene had shifted something in the air. It was no longer just a disrupted trap. It was birth. The Jaguar tried to stand again. Her front legs trembled. She was still weak from the pressure on her neck, from dehydration, from the effort. For a second, I thought she might collapse onto her own cubs. Instinctively, I took half a step forward and immediately stopped. She was still a wild animal. I couldn't cross that invisible line. She managed to stand. She staggered slightly. Then she looked at me. It wasn't a gentle look. It wasn't human gratitude. It was something simpler and deeper. Assessment, recognition. I had been a threat. Then I had been help. Now I was just presence. She lowered her head and carefully lifted one of the cubs by the scruff of its neck with surprising delicacy. She walked a few steps toward the thicker vegetation, stopped, returned for the second, repeated the movement. The men behind me shifted slightly, but neither of them stepped forward. And then something happened that I didn't expect. Before disappearing completely into the brush, the Jaguar stopped once more. She turned her head toward me, took 2 short steps in my direction, close enough for me to feel the warmth of her body, the scent of earth and blood and newly formed milk. She pressed her shoulder against mine for a second. It wasn't affection, it wasn't submission, it was contact, brief, silent, real. Then she pulled away, moving into the vegetation with her 2 cubs until the brush closed completely behind her. The silence that remained felt larger than any sound that had filled that place. One of the men cleared his throat. "You got lucky," he said. Maybe I did. But as I walked back toward the trail, my heart still pounding, I realized it wasn't luck that stayed with me. It was the image of those 2 cubs breathing for the first time. And the certainty that sometimes the unlikely part isn't the animal choosing to trust. It's the human choosing not to turn away.